Welcome to my channel, F1 News.
How F1 teams went from financial disasters to billion-dollar businesses. For most of Formula One's history, owning a team meant spending far more than you'd ever recover. But Mercedes just posted £83 million in profit last year, and Williams, worth almost nothing back in 2020, is now valued at over £1 billion. Two fundamental shifts completely transformed how F1 works financially, and teams that once struggled to pay their bills are suddenly worth more than some entire nations produce in a year. Back in the 1990s, F1 was absolutely merciless for smaller outfits. Teams would show up for a season or two, realize they were burning through cash at an alarming rate, and simply disappear. Simtek, Pacific, and Forte all arrived and vanished within a handful of seasons, unable to find any financially stable footing. The collapse always followed the same pattern: uncontrolled spending, shrinking sponsor income, and owners who eventually walked away. The only reason some teams survived at all was tobacco. Big Tobacco didn't just fund teams, it defined them entirely. The John Player Special Black and Gold Lotus wasn't merely a paint job. It was a full brand partnership that made the car itself a 200 fee advertising board. People called those cars John Player Specials more often than they said Lotus. Marlboro alone was reportedly paying Ferrari somewhere between $100 and $160 million annually from the mid-1990s after spending 23 years alongside McLaren. Other major sponsors, Rothmans, JP's, Lucky Strike, were pouring tens of millions into Williams, Lotus, and Barr. During the 1980s and 1990s, some teams were pulling more than 80% of their entire operating budget from a single tobacco arrangement. Then the politics arrived. The European Union's tobacco advertising directive banned sports sponsorship around the mid-2000s, effectively destroying the old financial model overnight. Teams scrambled for workaround liveries. Those blank white panels and barcode stripes on Ferraris were born directly from that moment. Minardi became the symbol of 1990s survival tactics. They kept going from 1985 to 2005 by cutting every possible corner. When Paul Stoddart purchased the team in 2001, he paid just $10 million for an operation that was essentially insolvent. Across their entire 20-year history, they scored only 38 championship points. Pay drivers became the norm during this period. When teams were desperate for cash just to make it to the next race, they'd take any driver who brought funding with them. For struggling operations, the logic was simple. A funded driver meant surviving another season. What made the 1990s so unstable was the complete absence of any safety net. Teams lived and died by whatever their sponsors decided, and when a major backer left, the team usually followed. The manufacturer era. When the cigarette money disappeared, the car manufacturers arrived, with budgets that would make any investor dizzy. Honda, Toyota, BMW, all came with resources that looked extraordinary on paper. Toyota constructed a massive facility in Cologne and entered as a full constructor in 2002. By 2008, their annual spending reached approximately $445 million, the highest on the grid, with McLaren and Ferrari also exceeding $400 million. This wasn't marketing spend. This was government-level money, and yet Toyota never once won a Grand Prix. Why were they spending at that level? Because on a presentation slide, the synergy looked perfect. Hybrid technologies were emerging, aerodynamic research fed into road cars, and the brand association boosted sales. BMW bought into Sauber, made solid progress, and actually won in 2008. Honda built up the Brackley operation that would eventually become the Mercedes team. Then 2008 arrived. The global financial crisis made spending $400 million a year on motorsport completely indefensible in any boardroom. Honda exited at the end of 2008. BMW and Toyota followed in 2009. Corporate appetite for loss-making sporting projects disappears quickly during recessions. The small team collapse. Through the 2000s, F1 had absolutely no spending restrictions whatsoever. It functioned as a pure financial arms race where the richest teams almost always won. McLaren CEO Zak Brown described it perfectly. Back then, F1 was simply about who could afford to lose the most money each year. When the financial crisis hit, manufacturers fled. Several new entrants arrived around 2010 hoping conditions would improve, but found themselves completely outmatched. Hurt entered in 2010 and shut down after 2012. Caterham started in 2010, spent years at the very back, and collapsed in 2014. Marussia accumulated over $200 million in losses between 2010 and 2014, entered administration and missed the final races of the season. Analysis covering 2011 to 2013 showed F1 teams combined for more than $520 million in net losses, with only 3 of 11 teams turning a profit. Even midfield teams weren't secure. In 2013, Lotus reportedly couldn't pay Kimi Räikkönen. The team owed him $24 million in salary. Force India went into administration in 2018 despite reasonable results on track after owner Vijay Mallya's legal difficulties cut off funding entirely. One team that approached things differently was Haas. When Gene Haas entered in 2016, instead of building everything internally, the team contracted Dallara to design their chassis and purchased engines, gearboxes, and other components from Ferrari. This reduced their required budget to roughly $100 million, about half what established midfield teams were spending. They operated with approximately 250 staff compared to 800 to 1,000 at top teams. Meanwhile, Mercedes spent around $484 million in 2019 alone, and Ferrari approximately $463 million. The Constructors' Championship was consistently won by whichever team spent the most money, right through to 2020. Spending literally bought performance. Bernie's system. Here's the honest reality of the pre-Liberty Prize money structure. Bernie Ecclestone transformed F1 into a commercial powerhouse. In 2018, F1's total revenue was around $1.8 billion, and teams received roughly 47% of television revenues. The real problem wasn't the percentage, it was how that money was divided. The entire system operated on 2 columns that effectively guaranteed the wealthy stayed wealthy and the rest stayed poor. Column 1 gave equal payments to teams that had finished in the top 10 in 2 of the previous 3 seasons. Sounds reasonable? It wasn't. This immediately excluded new teams and those going through difficult stretches. Column 2 was where things became genuinely absurd. Distribution was based on championship position, but the gaps were enormous. First place received 19% of the pot, while 10th received only 4%. If you were fighting at the back of the grid, you were being squeezed from both directions. It got worse. Ferrari received 2.5% straight off the top before anyone else was considered, simply for being Ferrari. Then there were Constructor Championship bonuses worth $100 million total, but only the top 3 teams could access them. Mercedes took 37%, Ferrari and Red Bull divided the rest, and everyone else received nothing. The system was so skewed that McLaren could finish 9th out of 10 teams, but still collect the 4th largest payout due to historical arrangements and bilateral agreements. Force India could have their best season ever, finish 4th in the championship, and still receive less than McLaren, who'd had a terrible year. It was completely inverted. Liberty's changes. When Liberty Media purchased F1 for $4.4 billion in 2017, they expected renegotiating the commercial terms would be relatively straightforward. The new Concord Agreement negotiations turned into a 3-year ordeal. The major teams were not enthusiastic about surrendering their advantages. Mercedes was particularly resistant, with Toto Wolff declaring that Mercedes was the biggest victim of the new proposals. By August 2020, Wolff was still refusing to sign, privately accusing other teams of being too accommodating toward Liberty. Ferrari retained both their historical veto power and a special heritage payment of approximately $50 million annually. COVID complicated matters further, and Wolff eventually admitted he changed position because he no longer believed the teams would ever reach agreement independently. Mercedes finally signed after last-minute conversations between Wolff and Chase Carey just before the deadline. The new numbers. The revised system demonstrably works. In 2023, Formula One Group's revenue reached $3.22 billion, of which 38%, approximately $1.22 billion, was distributed to the 10 teams. That figure grew from $1.16 billion the previous year. For 2024, Liberty reported F1 revenue hit $3.41 billion, up 5.9% annually, with operating income rising 9.1% to $791 million. Liberty's distribution model is considerably more balanced, though still imperfect. Every team receives approximately $35 million as a base payment automatically, regardless of performance. That alone already exceeds what some teams collected for finishing in the points under Bernie's arrangement. A much flatter sliding scale based on championship position replaced the old brutal column 2. The exact figures remain confidential, but the gap between first and last is now roughly $40 to $50 million rather than the $100+ million chasm that existed previously. Still meaningful, but no longer completely unreasonable. Ferrari still receives special treatment. They get 5% of the total pot as a heritage payment, actually up from Bernie's 2.5%, but the overall bonus payments have dropped from 31% of the total to 25%. A separate bonus pool exists for teams that finished in the top 3 during the past decade, which includes Ferrari, Mercedes, Red Bull, McLaren, and Williams. This draws from 20% of F1 revenue above $650 million, functioning as additional income rather than being taken from the main distribution. In total, 75% of prize money now goes to equal payments and performance-based distributions, versus 69% previously. The percentages sound small, but across more than $1 billion, those extra points represent tens of millions more reaching smaller teams. This is precisely why Guenther Steiner said Haas wouldn't exist without these changes, and why teams like Williams can now plan multi-year strategies rather than simply hoping to survive another month. The budget cap. The genuinely transformative development was the cost cap. Beginning in 2021, F1 introduced its first-ever spending limit, initially $145 million, reducing to $135 million from 2023 onward. This covers most race-related expenditure but excludes marketing, driver salaries, and the top 3 personnel at each team. The cap has real enforcement mechanisms. Red Bull's 2021 overspend resulted in a $7 million fine and a 10% reduction in aerodynamic testing allocation. Christian Horner acknowledged this meant the team could no longer prioritize development of the current car, redirecting resources entirely toward the following season. The cap changed more than spending levels, it transformed internal culture. Mercedes launched an applied science division to commercialize its expertise across other industries, explicitly designed to retain talented staff while staying within cap limits. Horner revealed Red Bull made more than 90 people redundant. Mercedes let go of 40 staff members. The development rhythm changed entirely. Teams can no longer force through mid-season upgrade packages, so every decision involves trade-offs between what you invest in now versus what gets delayed. Adrian Newey noted an unexpected consequence. F1 is no longer the highest-paying engineering sector, making it harder to attract top university graduates. Nevertheless, Toto Wolff stated that F1 under the cap had become a genuinely sustainable business where teams could accurately forecast costs and commit to multi-year planning. Guenther Steiner put it more directly. Without the cap, Haas wouldn't exist, and neither would several other teams, because the resource gap between the largest and smallest outfits had simply become too extreme. Teams finally making money. With expenses capped and revenues growing, most teams can now break even or better. In 2021, teams like Haas were finally competing at comparable spending levels, and owners no longer needed to routinely write personal cheques just to keep the lights on. 2023 marked a genuine turning point. For the first time in recent memory, multiple F1 teams reported real profits. Mercedes F1 posted $83.8 million in net profit despite poor on-track results. McLaren moved from a $9 million loss in 2022 to a $12.9 million profit in 2023. Ferrari's F1 program is similarly understood to be profitable. Not every team is in positive territory. Some midfield operations still report losses as they reinvest in infrastructure. Aston Martin posted a $27 million loss in 2022 while constructing a new factory and wind tunnel. Williams recorded a substantial $100 million loss in 2022 under new ownership during a period of rebuilding. Red Bull appears to operate essentially at break-even, reinvesting most income back into the program. Their 2023 profit was reportedly only $1.3 million, illustrating that even if teams can generate profit now, their competitive instincts push them to spend right up to the permitted limit. Across the sport, 80% of teams turned a profit in 2023, according to Sportico's analysis. Here are the numbers that really demonstrate how fundamentally the economics have shifted. F1 teams generated a combined $2.04 billion in sponsorship revenue in 2024, while Liberty paid out $266 billion in prize money. Red Bull and Ferrari each receive approximately $100 million annually from their title sponsors, Oracle and HP, respectively, which represents nearly 3/4 of the entire cost cap budget. Red Bull recently lost their Bybit deal worth $50 million per year, but immediately replaced it with Gate.io, illustrating how sought after these partnerships have become. McLaren generated $148.1 million in sponsorship revenue in 2023 across 53 different partners, with CEO Zak Brown describing it as the most commercial revenue a racing team has ever generated. Their largest individual arrangement is OKX at $25 million annually, complemented by major partnerships with Google, MasterCard, and dozens more. Mercedes, with 25 partners, still pulls in an estimated $150 to $200 million from sponsorship, with the Petronas arrangement alone worth $59 million in 2022. Even mid-grid teams are benefiting significantly. Aston Martin receives $75 million annually from Aramco. Teams that would previously have been scraping for survival now have solid commercial platforms. The average F1 sponsorship arrangement is worth $6.01 million, more than 8 times the NFL average of $745,000, with each team averaging $203 million in total sponsorship income. Prize money, while still meaningful, now functions more like a performance bonus sitting on top of the primary commercial income. In 2024, McLaren earned approximately $140 million for winning the Constructors' Championship, while Sauber received $60 million for finishing last, a much flatter distribution than Bernie's era, but still far smaller than sponsorship revenue for most teams. Valuations go stratospheric. One major consequence of F1's new financial stability is that team valuations have reached extraordinary levels. Every F1 team is now valued above $1 billion for the first time, with the average hitting $2.31 billion in 2024, up 44% from the previous year. Ferrari leads at $4.78 billion, followed by Mercedes at $3.94 billion and Red Bull Racing at $3.5 billion. Even Haas, 10th on the list, is valued at $1.02 billion. Williams, purchased by Dorilton Capital in 2020 for approximately $180 million, is now valued at $1.24 billion. Why did valuations climb so dramatically? F1 teams are now valued at 6.1 times revenue on average, up from 5.1 the year before, ahead of the world's top football clubs. F1 still trails the NBA at 11 times, NFL at 9.3, and MLB at 6.5, but the gap is narrowing. Teams also benefit from scarcity. Only 10 exist, compared to 30 or more franchises in major North American sports leagues. This success has created a protective mentality among existing teams. With each team now functioning as a scarce franchise, incumbent owners resist any expansion of the grid. Any new entrant must pay a significant anti-dilution fee, initially set at $200 million under the 2021 Concord Agreement, divided among existing teams as compensation. Given current valuations, most team principals now argue $200 million is entirely inadequate. Proposals for the post-2025 Concord Agreement suggest raising the entry fee to somewhere between $600 and $700 million. The General Motors and Cadillac situation illustrates this tension precisely. Despite Andretti having genuine racing credentials and GM backing, most teams and F1 management responded with considerable coolness. They cited concerns about diluting earnings and the sport's exclusivity. FOM argued the entry wouldn't add sufficient value to the championship. The decision proved deeply controversial. The Andretti organization took its concerns to the Department of Justice regarding potential anti-competition violations. Greg Maffei, CEO of Liberty Media, reportedly told Mario Andretti directly that Michael Andretti would never be granted entry to Formula One. In October 2024, Michael Andretti announced he was stepping back from day-to-day operations of his motorsport empire, handing control to business associate and part owner Dan Tauris. With Andretti removed from the picture, Tauris drove the project forward. This appeared to be the change F1 required. In November 2024, Formula One announced an agreement in principle with General Motors to add a GM Cadillac entry to the grid in 2026, with no mention of the Andretti name in the initial announcement. The team would operate as GM Cadillac, though it effectively remains the same program now led by Tauris. F1 was explicit that bringing a major manufacturer like General Motors aboard was a different proposition entirely from the original plans. Cadillac is developing its own power unit for 2029, and GM's presence will be a genuine asset to the sport. The BBC reported that GM agreed to pay a dilution fee of $450 million for their 2026 entry, more than double the $200 million specified in the 2020 Concord Agreement. The team will face hundreds of millions in additional startup costs. They'll use Ferrari power initially before transitioning to GM's own engines by 2029. Because the organization never stopped preparing for a 2026 launch, they should be positioned to debut alongside an entirely new technical regulation set. The team is headquartered at a new facility in Fishers, Indiana, handling the bulk of car manufacturing, while the race team and chassis designers work from Silverstone. This closed-door approach contrasts sharply with the 1990s and early 2000s, when teams arrived and departed regularly. Now, with the sport so financially attractive, the barriers to entry are extremely high precisely because existing teams refuse to let their billion-dollar valuations be diluted. When people ask whether F1 teams actually make money now, the honest answer is this: some do, intentionally, some don't, intentionally, and almost all of them could, which is the revolution. The economics finally function like a proper business, with enforced limits, recurring revenue streams, and a modern understanding of brand value. The achievement isn't that a few teams are profitable, it's that the system now allows them to be. The only remaining question is whether Cadillac can actually compete once they arrive. Top 5 finish in year 1? Let us know what you think below, and if you're new here, subscribe to F1 News for more breakdowns like this one.
Thanks for watching this video on my channel, F1 News, and please subscribe my channel and press bell icon.